It was another busy Tuesday afternoon at the corner fast food joint. The smell of sizzling burgers and salty fries filled the air as customers hurried in, placing their orders in loud, overlapping voices. The line stretched all the way to the door, and the sound of the cash register chiming mixed with the buzz of conversation. Behind the counter, employees moved like pieces on a chessboard, each one focused on their part of the chaotic operation. Some packed orders, others wiped down tables, and a few yelled instructions that were barely heard over the noise. The place thrived on a kind of organized chaos, but to an outsider, it looked like barely controlled mayhem. Amid this whirlwind of activity, 19-year-old Jake Thompson worked in the kitchen, flipping burgers with a steady rhythm that seemed at odds with the energy around him. While everyone else rushed around, Jake moved calmly and methodically. He worked with precision, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He didn't complain, didn't fumble, and didn't panic when a fresh wave of orders came through. His brown apron was stained with grease, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple, but Jake barely noticed. He had his routine down to an art. To most people, Jake was invisible. His co-workers barely spoke to him unless it was to bark instructions or ask him to take over their shift. Customers didn't even glance his way, their focus was on the food or their phones. The store's manager, Mr. Carter, seemed to think Jake's quiet demeanor meant he was nothing special, just another cog in the machine. But if anyone had paid close attention, they might have noticed the flicker of determination in Jake's eyes, a quiet fire that hinted at something more. In the far corner of the dining area, a man sat by himself. He was dressed casually in a gray hoodie and dark sunglasses, blending in with the other patrons. His tray held a half-eaten burger and an empty soda cup, but he wasn't paying attention to his food. His focus was entirely on Jake. Leaning back in his chair, he observed the young man's every move with quiet intensity, his expression unreadable. Occasionally, he sipped his drink or glanced around, but his eyes always returned to the kitchen. Jake didn't notice the man watching him. He was too busy with the grill, flipping patties and placing them on buns with a practiced hand. He double-checked each order before sliding the trays down the line, making sure everything was perfect. It wasn't that Jake loved this job, far from it. But he took pride in doing things right, even if no one else seemed to care. The kitchen was his domain, and here, he felt in control. Outside the kitchen, the fast-paced rhythm of the restaurant continued. A young mother struggled to keep her toddler from spilling his drink. A group of teenagers laughed loudly in the corner, their fries scattered across the table like confetti. A businessman in a crisp suit typed furiously on his laptop, his coffee forgotten beside him. The world moved on, oblivious to Jake and the quiet storm brewing behind the scenes. The real tension wasn't on the dining floor, though. It was building in the back office, where Mr. Carter sat hunched over his desk, scrolling through a spreadsheet with a scowl. His tie was loosened, and the sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing a faded tattoo on his forearm. Carter prided himself on running a tight ship, but his definition of tight often involved cutting corners and berating his staff. He'd been a manager for years and thought he'd seen it all until Jake came along. Carter didn't like Jake, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the kid's quiet nature or the way he never seemed fazed, no matter how much pressure was thrown his way. Or maybe it was that Jake's work ethic highlighted the laziness of some of the other employees. Whatever the reason, Carter had taken an instant dislike to him, and he wasn't shy about showing it. He saw Jake as an easy target, someone who wouldn't fight back. Back in the kitchen, Jake finished another round of orders and paused for a moment, wiping his hands on a towel. His gaze drifted to the clock on the wall. Another 4 hours to go. He sighed quietly, then turned back to the grill, ready to dive back in. To him, this job was just a stepping stone, a way to keep moving forward. He had plans, big ones, but for now, they were his secret. The man in the hoodie shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he watched Jake. There was something about the young man's quiet efficiency that intrigued him. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. To the casual observer, he looked like any other diner, but if anyone had bothered to really look, they might have noticed the hint of recognition in his expression. Whoever this man was, he wasn't here for the food. Meanwhile, Carter emerged from the back office, his scowl firmly in place. He surveyed the kitchen, his gaze landing on Jake. "Thompson," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. Jake looked up, his face neutral. "You call this clean?" Carter gestured to the counter, where a single ketchup smear had gone unnoticed. "If you can't keep your station spotless, maybe you shouldn't be here at all." Jake didn't respond. He grabbed a rag and wiped the counter without a word, his movements calm and deliberate. Carter smirked, as if he'd won some sort of victory, and turned to bark orders at another employee. Jake went back to work, his expression unchanged. He'd learned a long time ago not to let people like Carter get under his skin. But the man in the corner noticed. He noticed the way Jake handled the criticism without flinching, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence despite the disrespect. A small smile played at the edges of his lips as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Whatever he was thinking, it was clear he'd seen enough. The afternoon wore on, and the restaurant's chaos ebbed and flowed like a tide. Jake kept working, his focus unwavering. He didn't know that his life was about to change, that the man in the corner had plans that would upend everything. For now, Jake was just a kid flipping burgers, invisible to the world. But not for long. The storm brewing in the back office was nothing compared to what was coming next. It was still Tuesday afternoon, and the chaos of the restaurant continued, unrelenting as ever. Jake Thompson hadn't stopped moving since his shift began, his body on autopilot as he grilled, assembled, and packed up orders. Each movement was deliberate, practiced. His hands worked as if they were separate from his thoughts, allowing his mind to wander, though never too far. He couldn't afford to get distracted, not here, not under Carter's watchful, critical eye. "Thompson," came another sharp bark from the manager, who was now looming near the service counter. "Speed it up, we've got customers waiting." Carter pointed at the order screen, where a string of tickets scrolled endlessly. His tone was condescending, as though Jake was deliberately working at a snail's pace, though anyone watching could see that wasn't the case. "Yes, sir," Jake replied simply, his voice steady. He didn't meet Carter's eyes, choosing instead to focus on the grill. A quick flip of the spatula sent a row of patties into perfect formation, each one lined up for its respective bun. He wasn't here to argue, and he wasn't here to prove anything. This was just a job, a temporary stop on the road to something better. But still, Carter's constant berating was wearing thin. Carter, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on picking people apart. He folded his arms across his chest, standing just far enough away to watch Jake without looking like he was hovering. His eyes narrowed, scrutinizing every move Jake made, as if waiting for a mistake. If Jake noticed, he gave no indication. The man in the hoodie, sitting quietly in the corner, watched the entire exchange unfold with growing interest. He stirred the straw in his empty drink, leaning forward slightly as Carter continued to press Jake. The tension between them was palpable, though it was clear Jake wasn't rising to the bait. The hooded man tilted his head, as if trying to piece together the dynamics at play. What kind of manager treated his employees like that? And what kind of employee kept his composure so perfectly in the face of it? Jake's ability to remain calm under pressure wasn't a coincidence. He had learned, through years of hardship, how to keep his emotions in check. Growing up, he hadn't had much. His family struggled to make ends meet, and Jake had taken on odd jobs from a young age to help out. It wasn't glamorous, but it had taught him resilience. He'd been through worse than Carter's barking, and he'd come out stronger for it. Still, The restaurant wasn't an easy place to work. The kitchen was hot, the air thick with the smell of grease and burnt cheese. Orders came in faster than they could be filled, and there was always someone complaining, either a customer or Carter. Jake's co-workers were no help, either. Most of them were more focused on counting the minutes until their shift ended than on getting the work done. At the front counter, Maria, the shift leader, was frantically trying to calm down an irate customer who insisted his fries weren't hot enough. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice strained but polite. "I can replace them for you." The man scowled, arms crossed, as though her apology wasn't enough. Jake glanced up briefly, but he knew better than to step in. Carter didn't like it when employees overstepped their boundaries, as he put it. The man in the hoodie noticed, though. He saw how Jake's eyes flicked toward the counter, how he hesitated for just a moment before returning to the grill. There was something about this kid, the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to take everything in without saying much. The hooded man smiled faintly, his curiosity growing. In the back office, Carter's frustration was bubbling over. He didn't like how composed Jake was. Most employees cracked under his management style, they got flustered, made mistakes, and gave him the upper hand. But not Jake. The kid was too quiet, too calm, and it annoyed Carter to no end. "What's his deal?" Carter muttered to himself, scrolling through employee records on his computer. Jake Thompson. Hired 3 months ago. No prior experience in fast food, but he'd listed a string of part-time gigs on his application: landscaping, warehouse work, even tutoring. Nothing remarkable. Carter frowned. There had to be something he could use to knock Jake down a peg. Out on the floor, Jake continued working, oblivious to Carter's plotting. He didn't have time to worry about the manager's mood swings or petty power trips. He had bigger goals, though he kept them to himself. Most of his paycheck went straight into savings, with a small portion set aside to help his mom with groceries. He'd been researching colleges, hoping to study engineering. It was a dream he'd held onto for years, and this job was just one step toward making it happen. The hooded man shifted in his seat, his gaze never leaving Jake. There was something familiar about the kid, though he couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way he moved, the quiet determination in his expression, or the way he seemed completely unfazed by the chaos around him. Whatever it was, it intrigued the man more than he'd expected. By now, the lunch rush was winding down, and the pace in the restaurant began to slow. A few tables emptied out, leaving behind crumpled napkins and ketchup-streaked trays. Jake took the opportunity to catch up on cleaning, wiping down counters and restocking supplies. He didn't complain about the extra work, even though it wasn't technically his responsibility. He just did what needed to be done, without expecting recognition. Carter, however, wasn't about to let him off the hook. "Thompson," he called again, his voice sharp. "We're out of napkins in the lobby. Go refill them." Jake glanced toward the lobby, where a dispenser near the drink station sat empty. He'd seen it earlier and made a mental note to take care of it, but the grill had demanded his attention first. "On it," he replied simply, setting down the towel he'd been using. As Jake made his way to the supply closet, the hooded man shifted in his seat again, watching him go. There was something about this kid, something Carter clearly didn't see, or maybe didn't want to see. The man's curiosity had turned into something more, a quiet resolve to find out exactly what Jake's story was. Back in the supply closet, Jake grabbed a fresh pack of napkins and headed toward the lobby. He moved quickly, weaving through the tables with practiced ease. As he refilled the dispenser, he caught a glimpse of the hooded man out of the corner of his eye. It was a fleeting moment, but it stuck with him. There was something about the man's posture, the way he was watching, that felt different. Jake shook off the thought and returned to the kitchen. He had a job to do, and whatever the man's intentions were, they weren't his concern. At least, Not yet. The hooded man watched as Jake disappeared back into the kitchen, his expression unreadable. There was something brewing here, something just beneath the surface. And as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just another ordinary day, not for Jake, and not for the man watching him. "Jake, I don't pay you to stand around and daydream." Mr. Carter's voice cut through the steady hum of the kitchen, sharp and biting like a whip. The words echoed off the tiled walls, and heads turned in unison, the staff pausing mid-motion to glance at Jake. He froze for a moment, spatula in hand, as the weight of Carter's words hung heavy in the air. His cheeks flushed a deep red, but he quickly ducked his head, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. He muttered a quiet, "Yes, sir," and turned back to the grill. This wasn't the first time. In fact, it had become a regular occurrence. Carter, the fast food joint's manager, always seemed to have it out for Jake. No matter how hard the young man worked, it was never enough. The ketchup bottle wasn't perfectly refilled. Jake's fault. An order came out late because of a mix-up at the register. Blame Jake. It was as though Carter took some twisted satisfaction in making Jake's life difficult, singling him out whenever the chance arose. The rest of the staff kept their heads down, pretending not to notice. Some whispered quietly to one another, exchanging knowing glances, but no one dared to speak up. Carter wasn't the kind of boss you challenged. He was loud, quick to anger, and relentless when it came to asserting his authority. If you ended up in his crosshairs, you were on your own. Jake Thompson, though, had grown used to being alone. He didn't complain, didn't argue, and didn't let Carter's words shake him, at least not outwardly. Inside, the constant criticism stung, but Jake had learned long ago to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't afford to lose this job, not with bills to pay and dreams to chase. So he swallowed his pride, kept his head down, and pushed forward, no matter how unfairly he was treated. Carter, however, wasn't just a bad manager, he was a bully. Short-tempered and perpetually stressed, he ruled the restaurant with an iron fist. He barked orders at his staff like a drill sergeant, rarely offering praise but quick to point out mistakes. And for reasons no one fully understood, Jake seemed to bear the brunt of it. To Carter, Jake was just another clueless kid, a liability waiting to happen. But if he'd looked closer, he might have noticed something different, something deeper in Jake's calm, determined demeanor. "Move faster, Thompson." Carter barked again, his voice loud enough to make a customer in the dining area glance toward the kitchen. "You're slowing everyone down." Jake bit back a response, his grip tightening on the spatula. He wasn't moving slow, he never did. Every action was calculated, precise. But arguing would only make things worse. He slid a perfectly cooked burger onto a toasted bun, wrapped it in paper, and placed it on the tray, ready to be sent out. Carter stood behind him, arms crossed, scrutinizing his every move. Finally, Carter muttered, rolling his eyes as though Jake had taken an eternity to finish the order. "Maybe one day you'll figure out how to keep up. Until then, don't make me regret putting you on the grill." Jake's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain silent. He turned back to the next set of patties on the grill, focusing on the sizzling meat as if it were the only thing that mattered. He couldn't let Carter see how much the words got to him. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction. In the corner of the dining area, the hooded man from earlier watched the scene unfold. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes narrowing. There was something about the way Carter treated Jake that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just criticism, it was personal. The man could see it in Carter's tone, in the way he hovered over Jake like a predator circling its prey. It was unnecessary, cruel, and completely unprovoked. The tension in the kitchen was thick, but Jake kept working, his movements steady and controlled. He had learned to tune out the noise, to focus on the task in front of him and block out everything else. It was a skill he'd honed over the years, a survival mechanism born out of necessity. Growing up, life hadn't been easy. He'd faced his fair share of challenges, and he'd learned that the only way to get through them was to keep moving forward, no matter what. But even Jake had his limits. As the day went on, Carter's insults continued, each one chipping away at Jake's patience. "Is this your idea of a clean counter? That's not how we wrap the sandwiches here. Why do you look like you're half asleep? Pick up the pace." Each comment was louder than the last, designed to humiliate Jake in front of the rest of the staff. And each time, Jake swallowed his pride and kept his head down, refusing to let Carter get a rise out of him. The other employees noticed, of course. Maria, the shift leader, winced every time Carter raised his voice. She'd worked under him for years and knew how difficult he could be, but she also knew better than to intervene. Speaking up would only put her in the line of fire, and she couldn't risk that. Still, she couldn't help but feel sorry for Jake. He was a good worker, one of the best, actually, but Carter never seemed to see that. "Poor kid," Maria muttered under her breath as she handed a tray of food to a customer. She glanced toward the kitchen, where Jake was quietly scrubbing the grill. "He doesn't deserve that." "Carter's always been like that," said Miguel, another employee, as he refilled the napkin dispensers. "He picks on whoever's not gonna fight back. And Jake, well, he's too quiet. Makes him an easy target." "Yeah, but it's still not right," Maria replied, shaking her head. "Someone should say something." "Not me," Miguel said quickly, holding up his hands. "I'm not trying to lose my job." Maria sighed, knowing he was right. Carter was the kind of boss who thrived on control, and anyone who challenged him didn't last long. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. Jake wasn't like the others Carter had bullied in the past. There was something about him, something quietly strong, that made Maria think he could handle more than anyone realized. In the back office, Carter sat at his desk, scrolling through emails with a scowl. He'd always prided himself on running a tight ship, but lately, he felt like the place was slipping through his fingers. Sales were down, complaints were up, and corporate was breathing down his neck. It didn't help that Jake was such an easy target. There was something about the kid's calm demeanor that rubbed Carter the wrong way. He didn't like it when people didn't react to him. It made him feel like he wasn't in control. "Thompson thinks he's better than the rest of them," Carter muttered to himself, glaring at the employee schedule on his computer screen. "I'll show him." Out in the dining area, the hooded man continued to observe. He'd been there for hours, long enough to piece together the dynamics of the restaurant. He saw the way Carter barked orders, the way the staff flinched under his gaze, and the way Jake silently endured it all. But he also saw something else, something Carter didn't. Jake wasn't just enduring. He was learning. Watching. Waiting. The hooded man's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Whatever was happening here, he had a feeling it was only the beginning. And he wasn't about to miss what came next. The shift dragged on, but the tension in the kitchen only grew. Carter's voice continued to echo through the restaurant like an unwelcome alarm. Every time Jake finished one task, Carter found another excuse to call him out. "Thompson, that fryer basket isn't clean enough." Carter barked, standing so close that Jake could feel the heat of his breath. Jake didn't flinch. He simply turned, inspected the basket, perfectly clean, of course, and gave it another rinse in the sink to appease his manager. "Better?" Jake asked, his voice calm, almost too calm, as if daring Carter to find another fault. Carter's face twitched, a flash of frustration breaking through his smug expression. It annoyed him to no end that Jake never reacted the way most employees did. Where others scrambled to fix mistakes or stammered apologies, Jake remained steady, his calm demeanor like a mirror reflecting back Carter's own insecurity. "Don't get smart with me, Thompson," Carter growled. "Just do your job." "I am," Jake replied simply, turning back to the fryer without another word. The exchange didn't go unnoticed. Maria, still manning the front counter, cast a quick glance over her shoulder. She admired Jake's ability to keep his cool, but she also knew that standing up to Carter, even in small ways, was risky. Carter wasn't the type to let things go. Miguel leaned over and whispered to Maria, "Carter's gonna snap if Jake keeps that up. You know how he is." Maria nodded, her brows furrowed. "Yeah, but can you blame the kid? He's been putting up with this for weeks. Carter's way out of line." "True," Miguel admitted, "but still Carter's the boss. If Jake pushes too hard, he's gonna end up out the door." The thought of Jake losing his job made Maria's stomach twist. She'd seen it happen before, good workers pushed out simply because they didn't fit into Carter's rigid, toxic system. But something about Jake felt different. He wasn't like the others who had come and gone. He had a quiet strength, a resilience that made her believe he could handle more than anyone gave him credit for. Meanwhile, in the dining area, the hooded man continued to observe. His eyes followed Jake's every move, noting the way he handled himself under pressure. There was a calm efficiency to the way Jake worked, a sense of purpose that set him apart from the others. The hooded man leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the edge of the table. What Carter didn't realize, the man thought, was that Jake wasn't just enduring the abuse. He was absorbing everything around him, learning, adapting, and quietly preparing for something bigger. It wasn't defiance, it was strategy. And Carter, blinded by his own ego, couldn't see it. Back in the kitchen, the atmosphere was stifling. The heat from the grill mixed with the tension in the air, making it hard to breathe. Jake moved from station to station, his focus unwavering despite the constant interruptions from Carter. "Thompson, those fries are too salty. Start over." Carter snapped, even though no customer had complained. Jake glanced at the fries, then at Carter. "They're seasoned the way the guide says," he replied evenly. Carter's jaw tightened. "Are you questioning me?" "No, sir," Jake said, picking up the fries and dumping them into the trash. "I'll redo them." The other employees exchanged uneasy glances, their sympathy for Jake growing with each passing minute. Even Miguel, who usually kept his head down, muttered, "Man, Carter's really got it out for him today." "Today?" Maria whispered back. "It's every day." Carter's relentless nitpicking wasn't just about power, it was personal. He saw something in Jake that he didn't like, something that made him feel threatened. Maybe it was Jake's quiet confidence, or maybe it was the way he never let Carter's words rattle him. Whatever it was, Carter was determined to break him. But Jake was just as determined not to be broken. As the hours ticked by, the tension reached a boiling point. The lunch rush was over, and the pace in the kitchen slowed. Jake took the opportunity to catch up on cleaning, wiping down counters and organizing supplies. He worked methodically, his mind focused on the tasks at hand. But Carter, as always, was watching. "Thompson," Carter called, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Since you're so good at cleaning, why don't you scrub the floors while you're at it?" Jake paused, his hand gripping the rag he'd been using to clean the counter. He turned to Carter, his expression unreadable. "Sure," he said after a moment, his tone neutral. "Where's the mop?" Carter smirked, pleased to have found another way to assert his dominance. "In the back. And make sure you get under the machines. I don't want to see a single crumb when you're done." Jake nodded, walking toward the storage area without complaint. But as he grabbed the mop and bucket, a thought crossed his mind: why did Carter hate him so much? He'd never caused trouble, never talked back, and always did his job. Yet no matter what he did, it was never good enough for Carter. The hooded man watched Jake disappear into the back with the mop and bucket. He shook his head, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Carter was pushing too far, and it was clear to anyone paying attention that Jake didn't deserve this kind of treatment. But Jake wasn't just enduring Carter's abuse, he was learning from it. Each insult, each unfair task, each moment of humiliation was fueling something inside him. He wasn't just surviving, he was preparing. By the time Jake returned to the kitchen, mop in hand, the tension had reached its peak. He worked silently, scrubbing the floors with a focus that bordered on meditative. Carter hovered nearby, watching him like a hawk, ready to pounce on the first sign of imperfection. But Jake didn't give him the satisfaction. When the floors were spotless, Jake straightened up and returned the mop to the storage area. As he passed Carter, he said, "Floors are done. Anything else?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but for once, he couldn't think of anything to criticize. He glared at Jake, frustrated by the young man's unshakable composure. "Just get back to work," he muttered, turning away. Jake returned to the grill, his face calm but his mind racing. He'd endured Carter's abuse for weeks, but he knew it couldn't go on forever. Sooner or later, something had to give. And as the hooded man watched from his corner table, he couldn't help but feel that the storm brewing between Jake and Carter was about to reach its breaking point. By the end of the shift, the air in the kitchen was suffocating. Carter's voice had risen to an all-time high, carrying accusations and insults that echoed in every corner of the small restaurant. Jake remained quiet, his composure steady despite the storm raging around him. To the untrained eye, it looked like he was defeated. But there was something in his calm movements, something deliberate that hinted otherwise. "Thompson." Carter's voice boomed across the kitchen one last time, loud enough that even a couple of customers turned their heads. "You're useless. Do you hear me? Useless. I don't know why I kept you on this long." Jake turned off the grill with a quiet click, setting the spatula down on the counter. He turned to Carter, his face unreadable. "You're done here, kid," Carter said, his lips curling into a smug grin. He was enjoying this moment, reveling in his authority. "Fired. Go clean out your locker." The rest of the staff froze. Maria's eyes widened, and Miguel's jaw dropped slightly, but no one dared say a word. They knew Carter well enough to stay out of his way when he was on a roll. But deep down, they felt for Jake. It was unfair, everyone knew it, but fairness had never been a factor under Carter's rule. Jake didn't argue. He didn't plead or protest. Without a word, he untied his apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. The action was calm, almost graceful, as though this was just another task he'd completed perfectly. Carter watched him, his grin faltering slightly. He had expected some sort of reaction, a stammered apology, a plea for another chance. But Jake gave him nothing. He simply turned, walked to the locker room, grabbed his bag, and walked out the door. The restaurant was silent for a moment after Jake left. The employees exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Maria bit her lip, wanting to say something but knowing it would do no good. Miguel shook his head, muttering, "Man, that was cold." Carter, for all his bluster, looked slightly uncomfortable. He wouldn't admit it, but Jake's lack of reaction had thrown him off. He had wanted to see the kid break, to feel his power validated. Instead, he was left with a strange emptiness, as if he had won a battle but lost something greater. Outside, the cool evening air hit Jake's face as he stepped out into the parking lot. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The tension of the day began to slip away, replaced by a calm resolve. Across the lot, the mysterious figure in the hoodie watched him intently. The man leaned against his car, arms crossed, a curious expression on his face. His hood obscured most of his features, but the faint glow of the setting sun revealed a hint of amusement in his smile. Jake hadn't noticed him. Or maybe he had and didn't care. Either way, he walked toward his old bike, unlocked it, and began pedaling down the street without so much as a glance back at the restaurant. The hooded man watched him go, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was something about Jake's quiet exit that intrigued him. Most people, after being fired in such a public and humiliating way, would have been angry, frustrated, or at the very least upset. But not Jake. He moved with a purpose, his back straight and his pace steady, as if being fired was just another step in a plan only he understood. The man in the hoodie chuckled softly to himself. "Interesting," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the evening traffic. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot, following Jake at a safe distance. Jake's mind was quiet as he pedaled through the city streets, but beneath the surface, his thoughts were anything but. He replayed the events of the day, the sting of Carter's words, the humiliation of being fired in front of his co-workers. It wasn't the first time life had thrown him a curveball, and he doubted it would be the last. But he wasn't angry, not really. If anything, he felt relieved. For weeks, he had endured Carter's insults and abuse, biting his tongue and keeping his head down. He had told himself it was for the paycheck, for the stability. But deep down, he had always known it wouldn't last. People like Carter thrived on power, and Jake had been an easy target. But Carter had underestimated him. Everyone had. Jake turned down a quiet street, the sound of his bike tires humming against the pavement. He glanced over his shoulder briefly, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of the car following him. He didn't recognize it, but he didn't panic. If anything, he was curious. He continued pedaling, his pace steady, waiting to see if the car would follow him all the way home. The hooded man stayed a few car lengths behind, his eyes never leaving Jake. He could tell the kid had noticed him, but he didn't mind. In fact, he was impressed. Most people wouldn't have been so observant after the day Jake had just endured. But Jake wasn't like most people, that much was clear. The man had been watching Jake for weeks, studying him, waiting for the right moment to step in. He had seen the way Carter treated him, the way the other employees either ignored or pitted him. He had seen Jake's quiet resilience, his ability to stay calm under pressure. And he had seen something else, something Carter and the rest of the staff had missed. Potential. Jake wasn't just a hard-working kid trying to get by. He was something more. The man in the hoodie didn't know the full story yet, but he could see it in Jake's eyes, in the way he carried himself. This kid had something special, something Carter had been too blind to notice. And now, the man thought, the game was just beginning. Jake reached his apartment building, a rundown complex with peeling paint and flickering hallway lights. He locked his bike outside and headed up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The car that had been following him pulled over across the street, its engine idling as the hooded man watched Jake disappear into the building. The man sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He had come here to confirm his suspicions about Jake, and now he was certain. This kid was different. He wasn't just another fast food worker grinding out a paycheck. He had potential the man couldn't afford to ignore. Reaching into his pocket, the man pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The line rang twice before someone answered. "I found him," the man said, his voice low but confident. "Yeah, he's the one." There was a pause, then a voice on the other end of the line replied, "Are you sure?" The man glanced back at the apartment building, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, I'm sure. This kid's got something. You'll see." He ended the call and leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the building across the street. Whatever happened next, one thing was clear: Jake's journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The following morning, Jake woke up early, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the cracked blinds of his small apartment. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind, but they didn't weigh him down. If anything, they sharpened his focus. He had been dealt worse hands in life and always found a way to come out stronger. After a quick breakfast of toast and eggs, Jake sat at his second-hand desk, which was cluttered with notebooks and folders. He opened one of the notebooks, flipping past pages filled with scribbled diagrams, ideas, and notes. His eyes landed on a page with a title written in bold, underlined letters, "The Plan." For months, Jake had been working on something, though no one at the fast food joint would have guessed it. He didn't talk much about his life outside of work, and Carter had likely assumed Jake didn't have one. But Jake wasn't just some aimless teenager. He was building something that, when finished, could change his life entirely. He stared at the page, his lips curving into a faint smile. Getting fired wasn't the setback Carter thought it was. In fact, it might have been the push Jake needed to take the next step. Jake pulled out a pencil and jotted down a few notes in the margin, his mind buzzing with ideas. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, half expecting it to be Maria or Miguel checking in on him. Instead, it was a number he didn't recognize. "Hello," Jake said cautiously, holding the phone to his ear. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice that was deep and confident. "Jake Thompson." "Yes," Jake replied, his brow furrowing slightly. "Who's this?" "I'm someone who's been watching you," the voice said. "Before you hang up, hear me out. I think we can help each other." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. His first instinct was to end the call. It sounded like some kind of scam, but something about the man's tone made him hesitate. There was no desperation, no attempt to sell him something. Just calm, measured certainty. "Help each other how?" Jake asked, his voice cautious but curious. "Meet me at 2 p.m. today," the man said. "Corner of Maple and 5th. You'll recognize me." Before Jake could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in his hand, a mix of suspicion and intrigue swirling in his mind. Who was this guy, and how did he know Jake's name? Part of him wanted to ignore the call altogether, but another part, a stronger part, was curious. What if this was the opportunity he had been waiting for? By 1:45 p.m., Jake was standing near the intersection of Maple and 5th. It was a quiet part of town, lined with small shops and cafes. He had debated whether to show up at all, but his curiosity had won out. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he kept his hands in his pockets and scanned the area for anyone who looked out of place. At exactly 2 p.m., a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. He wore the same hoodie and sunglasses as the figure who had been watching Jake at the restaurant the day before. Jake's stomach tightened slightly, so it had been him. The man approached Jake, his movements unhurried but deliberate. "Glad you came," he said, pulling off his sunglasses to reveal sharp, calculating eyes. "I wasn't sure if you would." Jake shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "You didn't really give me much to go on." The man chuckled. "Fair enough. Let's take a walk." Jake hesitated for a moment before falling into step beside him. They walked down the street in silence for a few moments, the sound of their footsteps blending with the hum of traffic in the distance. "You've got a lot of potential, Jake," the man said finally. "More than Carter or anyone else in that place could ever see." Jake glanced at him, his suspicion growing. "How do you know so much about me?" "I've been watching you for a while," the man admitted, his tone matter of fact. "Not in a creepy way," he added with a faint smile. "I just pay attention to people who stand out. And you, my friend, stand out." Jake stopped walking, his arms crossing over his chest. "What do you want from me?" The man turned to face him, his expression serious now. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to offer you something. A chance to prove yourself. To show the world what you're really capable of. Jake frowned, his skepticism evident. And why would you do that? Because I see potential in you, the man replied. And because I believe in giving people a shot when no one else will. You've been underestimated your whole life, haven't you? Jake didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said enough. The man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. What if I told you I could help you turn that potential into something real? Something big. Jake studied him, his mind racing. He didn't know who this man was or what his motives were, but there was something about his offer that struck a chord. For so long, Jake had been fighting to prove himself, to rise above the low expectations others had for him. Maybe this was his chance. What's the catch? Jake asked finally. No catch, the man said. Just one condition, you have to be all in. No half measures. No quitting when it gets tough. If you're serious about making something of yourself, then I'll help you get there. But the rest is up to you. Jake considered the man's words carefully. He had learned to be wary of promises that sounded too good to be true, but something about this felt different. The man wasn't trying to sell him a dream, he was offering him a challenge. After a long pause, Jake nodded. All right. I'm in. The man smiled, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Good. You won't regret this. Back in his apartment later that evening, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change. He didn't know exactly what the man had planned or why he had taken an interest in Jake, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the verge of something big. As he sat at his desk, staring at the words the plan in his notebook, a new sense of determination washed over him. Whatever came next, he was ready. Outside, the man in the hoodie sat in his car, parked just down the street. He watched the light in Jake's window flicker, a satisfied smile on his face. The kid didn't know it yet, but he was about to step into a world far bigger than he had ever imagined. The man picked up his phone and made another call. It's done, he said. He's in. Now we can get started. The voice on the other end of the line chuckled. Good. Let's see what he's really made of. The restaurant was buzzing with an energy Carter had never experienced before. Reporters huddled by the entrance, microphones poised, cameras flashing. Customers who usually came for a quick burger and fries now craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had made this quiet little fast food joint the center of national attention. Carter's brow furrowed as he surveyed the scene. Something wasn't adding up. The tension in the air was palpable as Carter's eyes locked on Jake, standing at the center of it all. The kid looked different, calm, confident, and in control. His usual slumped shoulders were gone, replaced by a straight, commanding posture. And then there was LeBron James. The LeBron James. Sitting at one of the corner booths, casually sipping on a soda as though this were the most normal thing in the world. Carter's stomach churned as he pushed through the crowd. He plastered on a nervous smile, wiping his sweaty palms on his pants. Jake, he called, his voice louder than intended. What's all this? What's going on here? Jake turned slowly, his expression unreadable. He glanced at LeBron, who gave a slight nod, as if encouraging him to take the lead. Jake took a deep breath before speaking, his voice steady and clear. This, Jake said, gesturing to the cameras and the crowd, is about accountability, Carter. For too long, you've treated people here like they don't matter, like I don't matter. But you never know who's watching. Carter let out a nervous chuckle, glancing around. Now, hold on a second, Jake. Let's not make this into something it's not. You know how stressful this job can be. I've got to run a tight ship here. LeBron stood up, towering over Carter, his presence impossible to ignore. He set his drink down with a deliberate thud, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "A tight ship doesn't mean disrespecting your crew," LeBron said, his voice firm but calm. "I've been watching, Carter. And let me tell you, what I've seen. It's not okay." Carter's face turned pale. "You've been watching," he stammered. LeBron nodded. "That's right. For the past few weeks, I've been keeping an eye on this place. And Jake here? He's got more talent, more grit, and more heart than anyone else in this building. But you've been blind to it? Too busy tearing him down to see what he's really capable of." Jake took a step forward, his confidence growing with each word. "I wasn't just flipping burgers, Carter. I was paying attention to everything. The way you talk to people, the way you run this place, the way you push good employees out the door because of your ego. It's not right. And I'm not going to stay quiet about it anymore." Carter's jaw tightened, his composure slipping. "Now, listen here, Jake. You don't understand how hard it is to run a business like this. You don't know the pressure I'm under." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Pressure? You mean the kind that makes you yell at teenagers for working too slow or humiliate people in front of their co-workers?" "Yeah, I've seen it. And so has everyone else now." The reporters leaned in closer, their pens scribbling furiously. One of them called out, "Mr. Carter, do you have a response to these accusations? How do you explain the way you've treated your employees?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. But there was none. LeBron stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You know what makes a good leader, Carter? It's not power trips or tearing people down. It's building people up. And Jake? He's got that. That's why I'm here today to support him." Carter's mouth dropped open. "Support him? What are you talking about?" LeBron turned to Jake, a proud smile on his face. "Tell him, Jake." Jake hesitated for a moment, then squared his shoulders. "I've been working on something outside of this job, an idea, a project. And LeBron believed in me enough to help me make it happen. Starting today, I'm launching my own food truck business. It's called Jake's Grill and Grind. And I'm taking the lessons I learned here, both good and bad, with me." The crowd erupted into applause, customers cheering and reporters shouting questions. Carter looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. "You? A food truck? You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm serious," Jake said, a determined glint in his eye. "And I'll tell you one thing, at my business, everyone will be treated with respect." LeBron clapped Jake on the back. "That's the kind of leadership this world needs. And trust me, Carter, people like Jake? They're the future. Not people like you." Carter's face turned bright red as the cameras flashed. He stammered something incoherent before storming toward the back office, slamming the door behind him. Jake turned to LeBron, his expression softening. "Thanks for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." LeBron smiled. "Don't thank me, Jake. This was all you. I just gave you the platform. The rest? That's your hard work and heart. And don't forget, you've got a whole community rooting for you now." As the crowd began to disperse, Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not just as an employee or a kid trying to make ends meet, but as someone with value and potential. And he knew this was just the beginning. The reporters followed Jake and LeBron outside, snapping photos of them standing beside a sleek new food truck parked at the curb. The side of the truck was emblazoned with bold, colorful letters, "Jake's Grill and Grind, where respect is always on the menu." Jake grinned as he climbed into the driver's seat, the future stretching out before him like an open road. He glanced back at the restaurant one last time, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sometimes, he thought, the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's success. As the crowd continued to disperse, Jake remained by the food truck, soaking in the moment. He could hear the soft hum of the reporters' voices behind him, asking LeBron questions about his involvement in Jake's journey. But all Jake could think about was how far he had come, from that quiet, overlooked teenager in the back of a fast food joint to the standing on the verge of launching his own business, with the support of someone like LeBron James. It was surreal. LeBron's presence wasn't just a boost for Jake's business, it was a message, a statement. LeBron had always been more than just a basketball player. He was a symbol of hard work, resilience, and lifting others up. And now, he was standing beside Jake, reinforcing everything Jake had believed in himself all along. He wasn't just the kid flipping burgers anymore, he was the man with a vision. And the world was starting to notice. LeBron, sensing that the moment was slipping away, turned to the crowd of reporters and raised his hand to silence them. All right, let's wrap this up for today," he said, his voice carrying authority. "We've got a lot to look forward to with Jake, and you're all going to hear a lot more about him in the future. But right now, it's time for him to get to work." Jake smiled at LeBron's words, a wave of gratitude and disbelief washing over him. But before he could say anything in response, the reporter who had been asking most of the questions spoke up again. "Jake," the reporter called out, "I think I speak for everyone when I ask what's next for you. What can we expect from Jake's Grill and Grind?" Jake paused, looking at the reporter for a moment. It was a good question, one he had thought about countless times. But now, standing on the edge of his new life, the answer seemed simpler than ever before. "I'm going to work hard. I'm going to make this business a success. And I'm going to make sure that every person who works for me knows that they matter. That's what I've learned through all of this. Respect is everything. Without it, you have nothing." The reporter nodded, scribbling down his words, while others snapped more photos. Jake could hear the hum of the conversations around him, the excitement building as they processed everything that had happened. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel proud. This wasn't just about the food truck, this was about everything he had fought for. Everything he had endured. But there was still work to be done. As the reporters and cameras slowly began to leave, Jake climbed into the driver's seat of the food truck, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. The truck wasn't much yet, it was a small startup, barely more than a dream made real, but it was his. And that made all the difference. LeBron slid into the passenger seat, grinning. "You did good today, Jake," he said. "But remember, this is just the beginning. Now, it's time to build. Keep pushing, keep growing. I'll be here if you need me." Jake nodded, his grip firm on the steering wheel. "I won't forget this." "Thank you, LeBron." "You don't have to thank me. I just gave you a chance," LeBron said. "What you do with it now, that's all on you." Jake smiled. "I know. And I'm ready." With that, they drove off, the food truck rolling down the street toward the next chapter in Jake's life. The world outside was full of possibilities, of challenges, of opportunities, of customers who didn't yet know about Jake's new venture but would soon learn. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the streets, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement for what was to come. In that moment, Jake knew that his success wasn't just about the business he was building. It was about the journey, the struggles, the setbacks, the lessons learned, and the way he had risen above it all. He had faced the darkest parts of his life, and now he was standing in the light, ready to take on whatever came next. He glanced over at LeBron, who was watching the road ahead with a look of quiet determination. There was a bond between them now, something unspoken but real. LeBron had believed in him when no one else had, and now, Jake was determined to prove that belief wasn't misplaced. As the truck turned onto the main street, Jake saw a small crowd gathered outside a local park, drawn to the unmistakable scent of sizzling burgers and fries. A few people waved, some even shouting out, "Hey, Jake." And with a newfound sense of pride, Jake waved back. He pulled the truck to a stop in front of a popular spot, where food trucks often gathered, and turned off the engine. LeBron leaned over, his eyes twinkling with approval. "This is it, Jake. This is where it all begins." Jake took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was it. He had done it. He had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. As he began setting up the food station, people from the crowd began approaching, curious about the food. Jake smiled and started flipping burgers, his hands moving with confidence. Every burger he served was more than just food, it was a symbol of the new life he was building. And as the line of customers grew longer, he realized something profound: success wasn't just about the money or the fame. It was about the impact he could make, the way he could change the lives of the people around him, just like he had changed his own. By the time the evening arrived, the food truck was a hit. People had gathered around, sharing stories and enjoying their meals. The word was already spreading. Jake's Grill and Grind wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place that stood for something bigger. It stood for respect. It stood for resilience. And it stood for the belief that no matter where you started, you could always rise higher. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake looked at the bustling crowd and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was only the beginning, but it felt like a dream he had worked his whole life to reach. And it wasn't just his dream anymore, it was the dream of everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or treated unfairly. Because Jake's story wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. And for the first time in a long time, Jake knew that his future was in his hands. The fallout from the confrontation was swift and unforgiving. As soon as the cameras flashed and the reporters captured every word LeBron had spoken, the story spread like wildfire. It wasn't just local news anymore, it was everywhere. Social media exploded with reactions from people across the country, all voicing their outrage at how Jake had been treated by Carter. The hashtags #Justice for Jake and #RespectAtWork trend for days, as people rallied behind Jake's story, demanding accountability for Carter's toxic behavior. LeBron had made it clear, this kind of treatment wasn't just unacceptable, it was a reflection of a deeper issue in the workplace that needed to be addressed. He had publicly called out Carter, describing in vivid detail the unfair treatment he had witnessed, how Carter had belittled employees, bullied them into silence, and created an environment of fear and hostility. LeBron didn't just speak out for Jake, he spoke out for every person who had ever been mistreated in the workplace and didn't have a platform to stand up for themselves. Jake, who had once been afraid to speak up, now found himself at the center of a movement. It was strange, at first, to see his face plastered across news outlets and social media pages. He had never imagined that a single moment would change everything. But this was more than just about him, it was about the power of standing up for what's right, about fighting back against injustice no matter how small it might seem in the moment. The outrage continued to grow, with countless messages pouring in from former employees who had worked under Carter. They shared their own stories of mistreatment and humiliation. Some of them spoke about being overworked, some about being unfairly punished, and others about how they had been fired without cause. It became clear that Carter had a long history of treating his employees poorly, and now it was all coming to light. By the end of the week, the company had no choice but to act. The board of directors held an emergency meeting, where they decided that Carter's behavior could no longer be ignored. He was officially fired, his departure announced publicly with a statement acknowledging the need for better management practices and a commitment to creating a healthier, more respectful work environment. The company's reputation had taken a major hit, and it was clear that they needed to rebuild trust with both their employees and their customers. Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched the news unfold. It was like the weight of years of mistreatment had been lifted, not just for him but for all of the people who had been hurt by Carter's toxic behavior. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had won not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed to the edge, feeling like their voice didn't matter. And it wasn't just Carter's downfall that made Jake feel victorious. It was the fact that something had finally changed. The company didn't just fire Carter, they replaced him with someone who truly understood the importance of respect and leadership. The new manager, a woman named Karen, had spent years in the industry and had built a reputation for her empathetic approach to management. She made it clear from the start that the employees' well-being would be her top priority, and she promised to implement changes that would prevent the kind of toxic environment that Carter had fostered. Employees who had been too scared to speak up in the past now found themselves with a renewed sense of hope. They knew that things would be different now. There would be no more yelling, no more mistreatment. The changes had already begun. Karen had started implementing new training programs for management, teaching them how to lead with respect and fairness. She introduced regular feedback sessions where employees could voice their concerns without fear of retribution. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere at the restaurant began to shift, and employees felt more valued and heard than ever before. As for Jake, his life had changed completely. He no longer had to live under the shadow of Carter's harsh criticism. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, but through it all, he had remained focused on his goal: building his food truck business. He had already received several inquiries from local businesses about catering for events, and his food truck was booked for several upcoming festivals. His reputation was growing, and customers who had followed his story were excited to try his food. But there was something even more rewarding waiting for Jake. Just days after the news of Carter's firing had spread, Jake received a call that he would never forget. It was LeBron. "Hey, Jake." "It's LeBron," came the familiar voice on the other end of the line. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for a call from LeBron, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon. "I just wanted to check in and see how things were going with the food truck," LeBron continued. "And to let you know that I'm still here to support you. You're doing something great, Jake, and I want to help you take it even further. I'd like to offer you a personal mentorship, if you're interested. We can work together to help you grow your business, get more exposure, and teach you how to build a sustainable brand. You've got the heart, Jake. Now let's turn it into something even bigger." Jake was speechless. He had never imagined that LeBron would offer him such an opportunity. To have the mentorship of someone who had achieved so much in his life was beyond anything Jake had dreamed of. It felt like a dream, a sign that all the hard work, all the sacrifices, had finally paid off. "I don't even know what to say," Jake finally managed to reply, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I would be honored." LeBron chuckled. "No need to thank me, Jake. You earned this. You showed the world what it means to stand up for yourself, to fight for what's right. I'm just here to help you reach your full potential. Let's make this happen." The weight of the moment settled over Jake like a blanket. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for anyone who had ever been pushed around, belittled, or made to feel small. And it was a reminder that sometimes, all it took was one person to stand up, to refuse to back down, and to change the course of their life forever. Jake hung up the phone, a wide grin spreading across his face. He couldn't believe it. His dreams were no longer just dreams. They were real, tangible, and within reach. But beyond the business success, beyond the opportunities, there was a deeper sense of fulfillment in knowing that he had made a difference. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had created a ripple effect that would impact others for years to come. As Jake drove the food truck to his next stop, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. He had started in the back of a fast food joint, overlooked and underappreciated, and now he was on the verge of building something bigger than himself. It wasn't just about the food, or the money, or the fame. It was about respect, about standing up for what's right, and about never letting anyone dim your light. The road ahead was still long, but Jake knew one thing for certain: he was ready for whatever came next. And with LeBron's mentorship and the support of so many people who believed in him, there was no limit to what he could achieve. In the end, Jake had reclaimed his power. He had proven that standing up for yourself was the first step toward achieving greatness. And as he pulled into the next event, ready to serve up his food and connect with the crowd, Jake knew that this was just the beginning. The future was bright, and it was all his for the taking. Life has a funny way of flipping the script when you least expect it. The quietest person in the room, the one who seems overlooked or underestimated, might just have the loudest ally watching their back. And that's a powerful reminder to all of us. We often judge people based on what we see on the surface, without taking the time to understand who they truly are or what they are capable of. We assume that someone who stays quiet or works in the background is insignificant, but sometimes, those very people are the ones with the most to offer if only we take the time to see them. Jake Thompson's story is one of many that shows how powerful resilience and patience can be. He didn't fight back with anger or resentment when he was mistreated. Instead, he kept his head down, focused on his work, and waited for the right moment to reveal who he really was. It wasn't about getting revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about standing up for himself, and in doing so, he changed the course of his life and the lives of others. We all go through moments where we feel overlooked, like our potential is going unnoticed, or our hard work goes unappreciated. It can feel frustrating. It can feel like no one sees us, and in those moments, it's easy to think that nothing will ever change. But Jake's story proves that this isn't true. Even when no one else believed in him, he believed in himself. Even when he was treated unfairly, he never let it define him. He never lost sight of who he was or what he wanted to achieve. And eventually, his persistence paid off. This story also reminds us that the most powerful people aren't always the ones who speak the loudest. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones, the ones who observe, who think carefully, and who act with intention, that make the biggest impact. They might not be the ones who are drawing attention to themselves, but they are the ones who understand the value of patience and timing. And when the time comes for them to step into the spotlight, they do so with confidence and purpose. The truth is, everyone has a story. Everyone has a strength that can change the world around them, even if it's not obvious at first. Life doesn't always give us instant recognition or praise. We might feel ignored or unseen, but that doesn't mean we aren't capable of greatness. In fact, sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories to tell, and they might be waiting for the right moment to share them. It's easy to look at someone's current situation and assume that's all they'll ever be. We look at a person working in a fast food restaurant, or someone in a job that seems insignificant, and we think that's where they'll stay forever. But that's not true. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know the struggles they've faced, the lessons they've learned, or the dreams they're quietly working toward. The most successful people often start in places that seem unremarkable, but it's the work they put in, the lessons they learn, and the character they build along the way that makes all the difference. Jake wasn't a superhero. He didn't have any special powers. But what he had was determination, resilience, and a willingness to keep going even when things got tough. He didn't let the negativity around him define who he was. Instead, he let it fuel his drive to prove everyone wrong on his terms. That's a powerful lesson for all of us. When life throws obstacles in our way, we can choose to give up, or we can choose to rise above them. It's not always easy, and it might take time, but when we don't back down, we give ourselves the chance to reach our full potential. One of the most inspiring parts of Jake's journey is how he turned a negative situation into an opportunity for growth. Instead of allowing himself to be crushed by the unfairness of it all, he used it as motivation to make a change. His story wasn't just about getting revenge on a boss who had mistreated him. It was about finding his own voice, believing in his dreams, and making those dreams come true. And in the end, that's what mattered most, not the moment of confrontation, but the fact that he didn't let life's challenges stop him from pursuing what he truly wanted. And there's something even more important in Jake's story, the power of having someone believe in you when you don't believe in yourself. LeBron's mentorship and support came at the perfect moment. LeBron didn't see Jake as just another employee at a fast food restaurant. He saw the potential within him. He saw the resilience, the quiet strength, and the ambition that Jake had been hiding all along. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to believe in you, to give you the support you need to reach your dreams. For Jake, that person was LeBron. But for each of us, it could be anyone, someone who recognizes our potential, even when we don't see it ourselves. This story teaches us that success isn't just about what we achieve on our own. It's about the people who lift us up, the people who see our worth when we can't see it ourselves. Sometimes, the people who support us the most are the ones who've been where we are, who understand what it feels like to be overlooked or underestimated. They know what it takes to rise above those challenges, and they're willing to share that wisdom with us. Jake's journey also teaches us the value of perseverance. He didn't give up. Even when things were hard, even when he was treated unfairly, he kept going. He didn't quit on himself, and he didn't let other people's opinions dictate his worth. That's something we all can learn from. When things get tough, it's easy to throw in the towel and walk away. But the real growth happens when we push through the hard times and come out stronger on the other side. It's not the easy moments that define us, it's the tough ones. It's the times when we face adversity head on, and we refuse to back down. So, the next time you're faced with a challenge, remember Jake's story. Remember that the quietest person in the room might just be the one with the most potential. And remember that sometimes, success isn't about loud declarations or flashy accomplishments, it's about persistence, belief in yourself, and the quiet strength that drives you forward, even when no one else is watching. Keep going, even when it feels like no one sees your effort. Because one day, when the time is right, the world will see you for who you truly are and you will be ready. Life is unpredictable, and success often comes from the most unexpected places. So, the next time you feel overlooked, or when you think you're not being seen, just remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that are waiting to be told. And when your time comes, you'll be ready to step into the spotlight and show the world just how far you've come.